The telegram arrived at 11:47 in the morning, and no one thought to answer it immediately. This detail appears in the station log for March 14, 1889, kept by the Northern Pacific Railway Depot in Forsyth, Montana Territory. The handwriting is steady, the notation routine. Between the line recording the telegram's arrival and the next entry, a shipment of canned goods signed for at 1:15, there is simply blank space. Not urgency, not alarm, just the ordinary gap of a slow Thursday before spring. The telegram was addressed to Thomas Milbank, expedition leader, and it came from the Territorial Meteorological Observer in Miles City, 60 miles east. It read, "Barometer falling rapidly since dawn, front moving faster than predicted. Advise immediate return or shelter." Milbank was camped with 11 others along the Tongue River, 23 miles northwest of the depot. They had been there for 9 days, conducting a geological survey for a proposed rail extension. The weather had been cold but clear. Visibility extended for miles across the plateau. There were no clouds. The group included Milbank himself, age 41, a civil engineer with 16 years' experience in the Rockies, his assistant, Peter Glendon, 29, 2 surveyors from Chicago, a cook, a teamster, and 6 hired men, most of them former railroad laborers. They had 3 wagons, 2 tents, adequate provisions, and a detailed map showing the route back to Forsyth. The terrain was open. The road, such as it was, presented no particular obstacles. In his field journal, recovered 4 weeks later, Milbank noted the morning's work with satisfaction. They had completed mapping a ridgeline that had troubled them for days. The measurements were clean. Glendon had sketched the formations with care. "A good morning's work," Milbank wrote. "The weather holds." At noon, the cook served a hot meal. This was mentioned by 3 separate sources later, a luxury they had not expected given the conditions. The stove worked well. There was coffee. The telegram remained at the depot. No one rode out to deliver it because no one had been paid to do so. The standard fee for express delivery was $2. Milbank had left no such arrangement. He had said he would check in when he returned, likely in another 4 or 5 days. There was no reason to think he needed to hear from anyone sooner. The depot manager later testified that the telegram did not seem to require immediate action. He filed it in the general correspondence box, assuming Milbank would retrieve it on his next visit. "It was a weather advisory," he said, "not a distress call." In the camp, the men worked through the early afternoon. Glendon's notes described the light as exceptionally clear, almost crystalline. Visibility remained excellent. The horizon was sharp. At 2:30, Milbank made a decision that appeared at the time entirely reasonable. They would complete 1 more set of measurements before packing up for the day. The ridge they were mapping had a secondary feature, a saddle formation, that required another hour of work. After that, they could start back toward Forsyth the following morning, weather permitting. "We have time," he wrote in his journal. "No need to rush." At 3 hours, the barometer in Miles City read 29, 58 inches and dropping. The observer sent a second telegram to Forsyth, marked urgent. It was received at 3:12. The depot manager, by his own account, read it, noted the escalation, and decided he would mention it to Milbank when the survey party returned. "I saw no reason to panic," he said later. "Men camp in worse weather all the time." At 3:45, the wind changed. Glendon was the first to notice. He mentioned it to Milbank, who looked up from his theodolite and nodded. The air had shifted, not dramatically but perceptibly. It was coming from the northwest now, and it carried a faint metallic scent. Milbank consulted his pocket barometer. It read 29.91, which seemed fine. He tapped it. The needle didn't move. "Probably needs recalibrating," he said. One of the surveyors, a man named Raymond Howell, suggested they consider heading back that evening instead of waiting until morning. He had worked in Minnesota and recognized the smell of the wind. "I've seen storms come in fast," he said. "We could be back by midnight if we start now." Milbank considered this. Then he looked at the sky. It was still clear. The sun, though lower now, was bright. He could see for 20 miles in every direction. There was no front, no wall of cloud, no darkness. "We'll leave first light," he said. No sense wearing out the horses in the dark. The decision was entered into the field journal at 4:10 p.m. It was the last entry Milbank would make. By 4:30, the temperature had dropped 6 degrees. By 5 it had dropped another 8. The wind was steady now and stronger. The sky remained clear. At 5:47, one of the hired men, a Norwegian named Lars Henrik, asked if they should start loading the wagons. Milbank said no, they would do it in the morning when they could see properly. "Everything's fine," he said. "Get some rest." The sun set at 6:18. The temperature was 21 degrees. The barometer at the depot in Forsyth read 29. 34 and falling. At 6:45, the first snow began. It was light at first, sparse flakes, dry and small, that seemed to evaporate before they landed, the kind of snow that doesn't accumulate, the kind of snow that stops. By 7, it was heavier. By 7:15, the wind had doubled. By 7:30, a man standing 10 feet from the fire could not be seen clearly. And by 8, when Milbank finally gave the order to break camp and move, it was far too late. The last notation in the depot log that could be directly connected to the Milbank expedition was made at 11:52 a.m. on March 14th, 1 hour and 5 minutes after the first telegram arrived. It reads, "Weather advisory received for survey party, filed for collection." The next notation is dated March 16th. It reads, "No contact from Milbank party, status unknown." They had been 23 miles from shelter. The road was flat and clear. They had horses, provisions, and an accurate map. At 3:45 p.m., they could have started back and reached the depot by 10 or 11 that evening, cold but safe. Instead, they waited, and in the official inquest, conducted by the territorial marshal in May of that year, the question that was asked most often, by the families, by the railroad, by the investigators, was not what happened, but why they stayed. The answer, as it appeared in the depositions and reconstructed timelines, was simple and unforgivable, because nothing looked wrong. The weather on the northern plains in March of 1889 had been, by contemporary accounts, unusually stable. This fact appears repeatedly in the territorial records and in letters written by settlers and railroad workers in the weeks leading up to the storm. The winter had been cold but predictable. The spring thaw had begun early. There had been no significant storm since late January. Milbank's decision to extend the survey into mid-March was based in part on this pattern. His correspondence with the Northern Pacific Railway offices in St. Paul shows that he had requested an additional 2 weeks to complete the ridge survey, citing favorable conditions and clear working days. The railroad approved the extension on March 3rd. No one objected. The weather was cooperating. This sense of predictability shaped the daily rhythm of the camp. The men rose at dawn, worked until early afternoon, and rested in the evening. Meals were regular. The tents were sturdy. The stove, a cast-iron model manufactured in Ohio, provided reliable heat. In his letters home, Glendon described the camp as surprisingly comfortable given the location. He made no mention of danger. He made no mention of contingency plans. The surveying work itself was methodical and absorbing. Milbank's field journal shows that the team was operating on a fixed schedule. Measure, record, move to the next position, repeat. The days were structured around incremental progress. There was no reason to hurry. The contract allowed for delays due to weather, but there had been no weather to speak of. The only pressure was self-imposed, the desire to complete the work cleanly and return with a finished map. On the evening of March 13th, the night before the storm, the men played cards. This detail comes from the testimony of the cook, a man named Samuel Dorn, who survived the expedition. He recalled the evening as unremarkable. The fire was warm. The coffee was hot. Glendon won 3 hands of poker and joked that he would use the winnings to buy a new theodolite. Milbank sat apart, updating his notes. The wind was calm. The stars were visible. No one was worried, Dorn said later. There was nothing to worry about. This absence of worry was not carelessness. It was the product of experience. Milbank had worked in Montana for 6 years. He had supervised rail surveys in worse terrain, in worse weather. He understood storms. He understood risk. And he understood that overreacting to minor shifts in temperature or wind could waste time and exhaust men unnecessarily. The professional judgment required to lead a survey party was, in large part, the ability to distinguish between real threats and false alarms. On the morning of March 14th, there were no real threats visible. The barometer Milbank carried was a standard aneroid model, accurate to within 1/10 of an inch under normal conditions. When he checked it at 3:45 p.m. and found it reading 2991, he had no reason to doubt the instrument. It had been reliable for months. The fact that it was malfunctioning, likely due to a slow leak in the vacuum chamber, would not have been apparent without comparison to another instrument. And there was no other instrument. The nearest functioning barometer was 60 miles away, in Miles City, where the observer was watching his own needle fall and sending telegrams that no one in the camp would ever see. This is the gap that defined the disaster. Not ignorance, but isolation. Milbank was making decisions based on the information available to him, and the information available to him was incomplete. At 4:00 p.m., when Raymond Howell suggested leaving that evening, Milbank's refusal was not stubbornness. It was calculation. Moving in the dark, over unfamiliar ground, with tired horses, carried its own risks. A broken axle, a lamed horse, an overturned wagon. These were not abstract dangers. They were the routine hazards of overland travel, and Milbank had seen all of them. The question he was weighing was not whether to take a risk, but which risk was greater, traveling at night or waiting until morning. He chose to wait, and for the next 90 minutes, that choice seemed correct. The sky remained clear. The temperature dropped, but not precipitously. The wind picked up, but not alarmingly. At 5 p.m., when Milbank walked the perimeter of the camp, checking the tent lines and the picketed horses, everything was secure. The landscape stretched out in every direction, empty and visible. There was no wall of cloud on the horizon, no curtain of snow, no sense of impending collapse. Glendon, in his own notes, described the scene at sunset as strangely beautiful. The light on the plateau was golden and diffuse. The shadows of the wagons were long and sharp. He took the time to sketch the ridgeline one final time, wanting to capture the quality of the light before it faded. It was a moment of calm, and it was the last moment in which leaving would have been merely inconvenient. By 6:45, when the first snow began, the window for a clean departure had closed. Not because the snow was heavy, it wasn't, not yet, but because the temperature had dropped below freezing and the wind had increased to the point where visibility would be compromised within the hour. The horses, which had been calm all day, were beginning to shift and pull at their tethers. The men, who had been relaxed, were now watching the sky. At 7:00, Milbank made his second decision. He announced that they would wait out the snow. "It's a squall," he said. "It'll pass." This statement was repeated by multiple survivors. It was not delivered with bravado or false confidence. It was delivered as a fact. Milbank believed it, and there was reason to believe it. Squalls were common on the plains. They arrived suddenly, dropped an inch or two of snow, and moved on. Waiting them out was standard practice. But this was not a squall. At 7:30, the wind was gusting hard enough to flatten the fire. The snow was no longer falling. It was being driven horizontally, in sheets, with enough force to sting exposed skin. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees. Visibility was less than 20 feet. At 8 yards, Milbank gave the order to pack the wagons and prepare to move. But by then, the horses could not be harnessed safely. The tent stakes could not be pulled without risk of losing the canvas to the wind. And the men, who had been warm and dry an hour earlier, were now shaking and struggling to secure even the simplest loads. They did not leave, and the storm, which had seemed like an inconvenience, became something else. The blizzard that struck the Tongue River Valley on the evening of March 14, 1889, was later classified as an Alberta clipper. a fast-moving low-pressure system that originated in the Canadian Rockies and swept southeast across the plains with extraordinary speed. The meteorological observer in Miles City estimated that the temperature dropped 43 degrees in less than 6 hours. The wind sustained speeds of 40 to 50 miles per hour, with gusts exceeding 70. The snow, though not record-breaking in total accumulation, was fine and dry, the kind that drifts and penetrates every gap. The storm lasted 31 hours. During that time, the men of the Millbank expedition remained in their camp. They could not move, they could not see, they could not, in any meaningful sense, do anything but wait. And the question that haunted the later investigation was not why the storm was so severe, but why the decision to wait had felt so reasonable. Because it had felt reasonable. That was the testimony, again and again. It had felt like the right choice. It had felt like the safe choice. Until it wasn't. The exact sequence of the night is difficult to reconstruct. The surviving accounts are fragmentary, and they do not always agree. But certain facts are consistent across all testimony. The snow began lightly, the wind increased gradually, and the realization that they were in danger arrived not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, creeping certainty. Samuel Dorn, the cook, later described the first hour of snowfall as annoying, not alarming. He continued preparing the evening meal. The stove was inside the larger of the two tents, and the heat was sufficient to keep the interior comfortable. The men came in by groups, ate quickly, and returned to their own tent or to the wagons. There was no panic. There was no discussion of leaving. The assumption, shared by everyone, was that the snow would taper off. At 7:15, Millbank stepped outside to check the conditions. He was gone less than 2 minutes. When he returned, his coat and hat were covered in snow, but he said nothing to suggest concern. He sat near the stove, ate a portion of stew, and consulted his map. Glendon asked him if they should consider moving. Millbank shook his head. "We'd lose the road in this," he said. "Better to stay put until it clears." This was the third decision, and it was, in one sense, correct. The road, little more than a track worn into the prairie by previous wagons, would have been invisible in the blowing snow. Attempting to navigate it in darkness, with limited visibility, would have been extraordinarily dangerous. The risk of losing direction, of wandering off course, of exhausting the horses and the men in a fruitless search for landmarks, was high. But staying also carried a risk, and that risk was beginning to materialize. By 7:45, the temperature inside the tent had started to drop. The stove, which had been reliable all week, was struggling to maintain heat against the wind. The canvas walls, though doubled and treated, were not airtight. Cold air was seeping in through the seams and the flaps. The men began to layer on extra clothing, coats, gloves, scarves. They moved closer to the stove. At 8:00, Millbank gave the order to prepare the wagons. This is the moment that appears in hindsight as the last clear opportunity to act. The snow was heavy, but the wind had not yet reached its peak. The horses, though nervous, were still controllable. The men, though cold, were not yet incapacitated. If they had moved immediately, if they had abandoned the tents, loaded only the essentials, and started south toward Forsyth, they might have covered 5 or 6 miles before the worst of the storm hit. That would have put them within range of a line shack used by ranch hands, a small structure marked on Millbank's map, roughly 15 miles from their camp. But loading the wagons took time, and time was the one thing they no longer had. The process was supposed to be straightforward. The tents would be collapsed, the equipment secured, the horses harnessed. In good conditions, it could be done in 30 minutes, but the conditions were not good. The wind was strong enough now that the tent canvas had to be held down by multiple men to prevent it from tearing loose. The ropes were stiff with cold, the horses were pulling against their tethers, panicked by the wind and the snow. At 8:20, one of the hired men, a man named Joseph Carver, lost his grip on a tent pole. The pole swung loose, struck him in the shoulder, and knocked him to the ground. He was not seriously injured, but the tent partially collapsed. It took 4 men 10 minutes to resecure it. At 8:35, the wind increased again. Visibility dropped to 10 feet, then 5. The snow was no longer falling in flakes. It was a solid, driving sheet of white. At 8:50, Milbank called off the attempt to load the wagons. "We can't see the horses," he said. "We can't see each other. We're staying." This was the fourth decision, and it was final. The men retreated into the tents. The stove was stoked as high as it would go. The entrance flaps were tied shut. Outside, the wind howled. The temperature continued to drop. Dorn later testified that the mood inside the tent shifted at this point. It was no longer confident. It was no longer calm. The men were quiet. They sat close to the stove, wrapped in blankets, and waited. No one spoke of what might happen if the storm didn't stop. No one spoke of what they would do if the fuel ran out, or if the tent failed, or if the cold became unbearable. They simply waited. At some point during the night, Dorn could not say exactly when, Milbank pulled out his journal and began to write. He did not write much, just a few lines, in steady, careful handwriting. The entry was dated March 14th, and it was the last one he would complete. It read, "Storm intensified beyond prediction. Unable to move. Will attempt departure at first light. Morale steady. Supplies adequate." It was a professional assessment. Calm, measured. It contained no blame, no panic, no despair. But it also contained an assumption that would prove false. That there would be a first light. That the storm would pass. That in the morning they would be able to leave. The storm did not pass. At dawn on March 15th, the wind was still blowing at 40 miles per hour. The snow was still falling. The temperature was 8 degrees below zero. The tent was still standing, but the fuel for the stove was running low. The men were cold, but not yet in crisis. They ate a small breakfast, hardtack and coffee, and waited. Milbank proposed that they attempt to move at midday, when the light would be strongest. Glendon agreed. The men prepared as best they could. But when midday came, the visibility was no better. The wind was no weaker. And the decision was made again, to wait. This was the fifth decision, and with it, the window closed entirely. By the afternoon of March 15th, the fuel was nearly gone. The stove was producing only minimal heat. The men had retreated into their bedrolls, conserving warmth. Outside, the snow had drifted to a depth of 3 feet in some places. The wagons were buried, the horses still tethered, were standing motionless, their heads down, their backs covered in ice. At some point during the second night, one of the horses died, then another. By the morning of March 16th, 4 of the 6 were gone. The men inside the tent did not know this yet. They knew only that the storm was still raging, that the cold was worsening, that the fuel was gone, and that they had waited too long. The moment of realization did not come as a sudden revelation. It came gradually, in the accumulation of small, irreversible facts. The stove went out. The temperature inside the tent dropped to match the temperature outside. The men stopped talking. They stopped moving. They lay in their bedrolls, conserving energy, breathing slowly, waiting for something to change. But nothing changed. On the morning of March 17th, the storm began to ease. The wind dropped. The snow thinned. By midday, the sky was visible. By evening, it was clear. The men tried to leave. They could not. The first rescue party reached the camp on March 21st, 7 days after the storm began. They had been dispatched from Forsyth on March 18th, after the depot manager reported that the Milbank survey party had not returned and had not sent word. The party consisted of 6 men, including a territorial marshal, 2 railroad employees, and 3 local ranchers familiar with the terrain. They found the camp without difficulty. The wagons were still there, half buried in snowdrifts. The tents were still standing, though the canvas was torn and sagging. The horses were dead, frozen where they had been tethered. Inside the larger tent they found 5 men. 4 were dead. 1, Samuel Dorn, was alive, but barely. He was conscious but unable to speak clearly. His hands and feet were severely frostbitten. He was transported to Forsyth, and then to Miles City, where a surgeon amputated 3 fingers and both of his feet below the ankle. He survived. The bodies of the other men were found in various locations. 2 were inside the smaller tent. 3 were outside near the wagons, as if they had been attempting to dig out or to reach supplies. One man, Peter Glendon, was found 70 yards from the camp, lying face down in the snow. He had been walking south toward Forsyth. He had made it less than 1/10 of a mile. Thomas Milbank was found inside the larger tent, sitting upright against a trunk, still wrapped in his blanket. His journal was beside him. His hands were folded in his lap. He appeared, the marshal later wrote, as if he had simply gone to sleep. The official cause of death for all 11 men who did not survive was listed as exposure and hypothermia. The inquest, conducted over 3 weeks in May, concluded that the deaths were accidental and that no individual bore criminal responsibility. The report noted that the storm was of unusual severity and arrived with minimal warning. It noted that the decision to remain in camp was consistent with standard practice for survey parties. It noted that the men were experienced and well-equipped. But the families asked a different question. Why had they stayed? The territorial marshal, in his final report, attempted to answer this. He wrote, "The survey party had every reason to believe that the storm would be short-lived and that remaining in camp was the safer course of action. The decision to delay departure was made in good faith, based on the available information. No negligence can be attributed to Mr. Milbank or to any member of the party." This explanation satisfied no one. Raymond Howell's widow, in a letter to the railroad, wrote, "My husband told Mr. Milbank that we should leave. He said it at 4 hours in the afternoon, when the sky was still clear. If they had listened, if they had left then, they would all be alive. They had time. They chose not to use it." The depot manager in Forsyth was questioned extensively about the telegrams. He maintained that he had acted appropriately. "I am not a messenger," he said. "I am a station agent. If Mr. Milbank had wanted immediate notification of weather advisories, he should have arranged for it. He did not. I cannot be held responsible for that." The meteorological observer in Miles City testified that his warnings had been clear and timely. "I sent 2 telegrams," he said. The first at 11:47, the second at 3:12. Both stated that a front was moving rapidly and that shelter or return was advised. "I do not know what else I could have done." The railroad, in its own internal review, concluded that the tragedy was an unfortunate consequence of unpredictable weather and that no procedural failures occurred. The company offered compensation to the families, $1,000 per deceased worker, and closed the file. But the question persisted. Why had they stayed? The answer, as it emerged from the testimony and the reconstructed timeline, was not simple. It was not a single error. It was not a moment of panic or a failure of leadership. It was instead a series of small, reasonable decisions, each of which seemed correct at the time, and each of which made the next decision more difficult. They stayed because the sky was clear. They stayed because the barometer was broken, and they didn't know it. They stayed because traveling in the dark was dangerous. They stayed because the snow seemed light. They stayed because storms usually passed quickly. They stayed because by the time they realized the storm was not passing, it was too late to leave safely. And they stayed because, at every stage, the choice to wait felt like the prudent choice. This is the testimony that recurs in the depositions. The decision to stay was not reckless. It was cautious. It was the decision a reasonable person, with reasonable information, would make, and it killed them. In his own testimony, Samuel Dorn, the only survivor, was asked if he believed Milbank had made a mistake. He paused for a long time before answering. "No," he said finally. "I don't think he made a mistake. I think he made the same choice any of us would have made. We all thought we had time." He paused again. "We were wrong." The file on the Milbank expedition, preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives in Helena, is not large. It consists of the inquest report, the testimony transcripts, Milbank's field journal, a handful of letters, and the 2 telegrams that were never delivered. The documents are clean and well preserved. The handwriting is legible. The facts are clear. But the meaning of those facts remains elusive. There is no dramatic moment in the record, no villain, No sudden catastrophe. No point at which an observer, reading through the timeline, can say with certainty, "This is where it went wrong." The disaster unfolded slowly, across hours and then days, in a series of decisions that seemed, individually, to be correct. And that is what makes the story difficult to process. We expect tragedies to have clear causes. We expect them to be the result of negligence or malice, or extraordinary bad luck. We expect them to involve moments of clarity, moments when someone knew or should have known that disaster was imminent and chose badly. But the Millbank expedition does not fit this pattern. The men who died on the Tongue River in March of 1889 were not reckless. They were not unprepared. They were not gambling. They were doing what experienced men in their position would do, weighing risks, making judgments, and trying to avoid unnecessary danger. They failed not because they took risks, but because they tried to avoid them. This paradox is noted obliquely in the Marshal's final report. He writes, "The decision to remain in camp was, at the time it was made, the safer choice. It was only in hindsight, after the storm exceeded all reasonable predictions, that the decision proved fatal. But hindsight is all we have, and in hindsight, the chain of missed opportunities is painfully clear. The telegrams that were not delivered, the broken barometer that was not checked, the suggestion to leave early that was dismissed, the moment at 3:45 p.m. when the sky was clear and the road was open and 23 miles was nothing, just a long afternoon's ride. That was the moment. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing did. If there is a lesson in the file, it is this, that time is not a constant, that the moment when action is possible and the moment when action is necessary are not always the same, and that the gap between them can close so quietly that no one notices until it is too late. The men of the Millbank expedition had time, and then they didn't, and the transition between those two states was so gradual, so unremarkable, that it felt like no transition at all. In his last journal entry, written by firelight on the night of March 14th, Thomas Millbank assessed his situation and found it manageable. "Morale steady," he wrote. "Supplies adequate." He believed, as any reasonable person would, that the morning would bring clarity, that the storm would pass, that they would leave when it was safe to do so. He was making the best decision he could with the information he had, and he was wrong. The file does not record what Millbank thought, if anything, during the final hours. It does not record whether he regretted his choices or whether he understood, in those last cold moments, what had gone wrong. The journal ends on March 14th. The testimony of the survivors covers only the mechanics of survival. The rest is silence. What remains is the simple, irreducible fact that they had a choice, and they made it, and the choice was fatal. Not because it was foolish, but because it was reasonable. And that is the part that stays with you when you close the file and return it to the archive. The part that resists easy conclusions. The part that suggests, uncomfortably, that the men who died on the Tongue River were not so different from any of us. That they were trying to be careful. That they were trying to be safe. That they were doing what seemed right. And that it was not enough. The weather on March 14, 1889, did not announce itself. It did not give a warning that could not be ignored. It simply arrived, quietly, and by the time the men realized what was happening, the window for escape had closed. They had time. And then they didn't. And the space between those two truths is where the tragedy lives. In the years following the disaster, the Northern Pacific Railway installed a series of weather stations along the proposed survey route. They established protocols for mandatory check-ins. They required survey parties to carry multiple barometers and to maintain regular contact with the nearest depot. They did not, the railroad noted in its revised safety guidelines, want a repeat of the Millbank incident. But the guidelines could not undo what had happened. They could not restore the 11 men to their families. They could only prevent the same mistake from being made again, and even that was uncertain, because the mistake was not, in the end, a procedural failure. It was not a gap in training or a lack of equipment. It was something more fundamental. the failure to recognize in real time that the moment for action had arrived. That recognition requires not just information, but interpretation. It requires the ability to see that the safe choice and the right choice are not always the same. It requires the willingness to act when the evidence is incomplete and the risks are unclear. And it requires, above all, the understanding that time, the time to choose, the time to move, the time to save yourself, is not infinite. It runs out, and when it does so quietly. The Milbank expedition is not famous. It does not appear in most histories of the American West. It is not taught in schools. The men who died are not remembered outside of their own families, and even there the memory has faded. The file in Helena is consulted rarely, mostly by researchers interested in the meteorological aspects of the 1889 storm season, or by railroad historians tracking the expansion of the Northern Pacific. But for those who do read the file, the story lingers, because it is not a story about a storm. It is a story about time, about the moments when we think we have it and the moments when we don't, about the gap between safety and danger and how small that gap can be, and how impossible it is to see until you've already crossed it. The men on the Tongue River had a choice. They made it carefully, they made it reasonably, they made it with the best information they had, and it was the wrong choice. Not because they were foolish, but because they were human, and because, in the end, the storm did not care about their reasons. It simply came, and when it did, they were still there, waiting for a break in the weather that never arrived, believing, even as the wind rose and the snow fell, that they still had time. They didn't, and that is the story.